In Your Dreams by Tom Holts. Chapter 1. 5:25 on a cold autumn Friday. Outside, central London growled and shoved its way homewards in a blaze of white, green, red and amber light. In the cashier's office on the top floor of 70 St Mary's, Benny Shumway glanced up at the clock on the wall opposite his desk. Time to cash up and then home. He leaned forward, grabbed a handful of pink cash chits out of his in-tray and leafed through them quickly, his mind adding up the numbers faster than Silicon could ever manage. A quick note in the big ledger, another in the small ledger, and the one true ledger and the other ledger, a precise thumb click on the end of his silver Parker ballpoint. 5 feet 2 inches tall, bearded and windscreened by bottle-end spectacles as thick as tank armour, Benny Shumway worked with the speed, precision and assurance of a Japanese swordsman. Last chore, the banking. He flipped open the lid of the cash box, took out a thick wad of £50 notes and riffled through them like a New Orleans gambler shuffling cards. £12,850. It being Friday night, no cash to be left on the premises over the weekend, he pulled the paying-in book out of the top drawer of his desk, uncapped a bic one-handed, jotted down the amount, the date, account details, flicked out the slip, put the book away, laid the slip on top of the neatly faced-up banknotes and recapped the bic. The paying-in slip bore the words Bank of the Dead in 12-point Garamond capital italics. Whistling a long-forgotten tune, Benny Shumway dipped in his pocket, produced an all-genuine, all-brass sipor, and thumbed the wheel. As the flame caught and blossomed, he picked up the stack of currency, plus the paying-in slip, and held the flame against the short end. The notes caught. He turned his wrist, expertly nursing the infant fire, while with his other hand he reached for what looked like a wide, flat-bottomed tourist-wear brass Benares ashtray. Just as the flames were about to lick his fingertips, he dropped the blazing money into the tray and watched as it curled into white ash. That done, Benny Shumway wriggled into his overcoat, flipped off the lights, and trotted down the stairs. He was 2 minutes behind schedule, but luckily the Goblins hadn't locked up yet. At 6:20, Paul Carpenter was standing beside the road, hating his car. It hadn't been his idea in the first place, but he'd been too shocked to refuse at the time, and by then it was too late. Promotion from junior clerk to clerk meant that he was entitled to a company car. Since the company in question was J.W.Wells Co, the car wasn't your run-of-the-mill Volkswagen Polo. In fact, until a few months ago, it had been a third-level sorcerer's apprentice employed by Gerhard Faust GmbH of Frankfurt, one of J.W.Wells' oldest and most intransigent business rivals. It, or she, had accepted the sideways promotion with stoical good grace. After all, as Ricky Wormtoter, the pest control partner, had said at the time, it could have been worse, could have been a Ford, or even, cruelly and unusually, a Rover Metro. And up until now, Paul and Monica had got on reasonably well together. Up till now. He'd tried magic, of course. Where engine trouble was concerned, magic was his first resort, and also his last. Since he'd joined J.W.W 6 months ago, he'd learned quite a lot of rudimentary magic, as was essential if he was to pull his weight as an employee of the oldest and most respected firm of sorcerers and thaumaturgical consultants in the UK. He'd learned that magic is just a fancy term for the process of turning things from how they are to how they ought to be. And a Volkswagen Polo ought to go vroom when you press the accelerator pedal. "Please," he asked nicely, but that failed too. He swore under his breath. The car radio clicked into life. "Ich kann dich hören," it said reproachfully. "Das ist nicht höflich." Paul scowled. It'd been a long day. 6 o'clock start, driving from London to a pub car park in some god-forsaken place in Outer Gloucestershire to hand over a brown A4 manila envelope to, he shuddered just thinking about it, a red-eyed, rat-headed goblin wearing a Marks and Sparks suit 3 sizes too big for it. "Talk English, for crying out loud, I know you can!" The car radio tutted at him. "You should make effort," she said. "It's bad enough for me being car." "I'm sorry," Paul muttered. Monica had a lovely voice, but she did tend to be bossy. "Can you tell me what's wrong with you?" Ja, it's obvious. Die Kopfdichtung. Anybody should know this." Paul sighed. The what is what?
Zylinderkopfdichtung.
Monica clicked her virtual tongue.
I do not know what it is in English, but it is very bad. I am very sick. You must call for assistance.
Yes, right, Paul snapped. And I expect you know how I'm supposed to go about finding a garage in the middle of the nowhere at 6 o'clock on a Friday.
Natürlich,
Monica interrupted.
In my glove box is 1996 edition of AA Members Handbook. On page 386 is list of local garages. Third from top is Gorse Hill Motors. Telephone number?
Paul pressed keys on his mobile. Nobody answered for a very long time. Just as he was about to ring off, a voice said, "What?" Paul took a deep breath. "Hello," he said. I wonder if you could help me. My car's broken down and I was hoping, can you come out and sort of fix it?" A long silence, and then the voice said, "Hang on, I'll get someone." "Thanks," Paul said. It was either a woman's voice or a child's. If he'd been on oath, he'd have had to say it was probably the latter. Well, he thought, family-run business in rural Gloucestershire, nothing unusual about that. "Well," said another voice. "Hello," Paul said. "I was wondering if—"
"Skip all that,"
said the new voice, and this time, absolutely no doubt about it, this time it was definitely a kid, a girl somewhere between the age of 7 and 9.
"What's the problem?"
Paul said. "Well, it was making this horrible sort of clonking noise, and then it started blowing out great clouds of blue smoke, and now it won't go at all." The unseen 7-year-old clicked her tongue.
"Cylinder head gasket," she said. "All right, we'll come and pick it up. Where are you?"
"I'm not sure." Monica would know, of course. She had some kind of satellite navigation system that told her where she was to the nearest centimetre. Unfortunately, he couldn't make head nor tail of it, and he couldn't very well say, "Hold on, you'd better ask my car." He leaned in through the driver's door and stared at the little screen where the ashtray should have been. "Well, if this road's the B5632...
"It isn't."
"Oh." He wasn't sure how the kid knew that, but he wasn't going to argue. "In that case, I don't know."
"It's all right," said the kid wearily. "We've got you. Hang on, we'll be there in 20 minutes.
The kid had rung off. Paul shrugged and sat in the driver's seat. It was too cold to stand about in the open.
"You are calling the garage?"
Monica asked. Paul nodded. He knew she could see him, though he had no idea what with. "They're sending someone," he replied. 20 minutes.
"Sehr gut,"
she groaned softly.
"It hurts, but I am brave."
"We play hangman?" Paul sighed wearily. "Oh, all right," he said. For some reason, Monica loved playing hangman, though her limited English vocabulary didn't help. Also, she got very tense when she lost. In the event, it only took 18 minutes for the pickup truck to arrive, but it seemed much longer. "Here is garage," Monica announced suddenly. A moment later, a pair of bright white eyes flared in the rearview mirror. Paul got out.
"Use the brake down,"
said a voice from the darkness, as the truck drew up beside him. Yes, that's—" Paul broke off. Another one who sounded like a child. Wasn't there some gas or something that made your voice go high and squeaky? The truck doors opened, 2 small figures climbed out and walked towards him. The one on the left was male, very short blonde hair, shirt tails hanging out under a green pullover, age probably 10. On the right, a 9-year-old girl with a ponytail, wearing lilac jeans and matching trainers. The girl was carrying, apparently without effort, a toolbox that looked like it weighed more than she did.
"What's the problem?"
asked the girl briskly. It took Paul a moment to answer. It was making this terrible clunky noise, and there's a sort of blue smoke, and now it won't go at all." The girl looked up at him. She had clear blue eyes and freckles.
"Keys?"
Paul blinked. "Sorry?"
"Keys,"
she repeated irritably. Oh, right, in the ignition." She nodded.
"All right," she said. "Stand back."
Paul did so, and apparently ceased to exist. The boy jumped into the driver's seat, leant over and flipped the bonnet lock, whereupon the conversation between him and the girl became technical and Paul tuned out. He'd seen weirder things, true, ever since he joined J.W.W. He'd seen goblins, real ones with round red eyes and tusks, and found out they owned the freehold of 70 St Mary Axe. He'd seen a human being turned into a photocopier before his very eyes, and learned that the long stapler used for tacking sheets of A3 together was in fact the firm's senior partner, transfigured into a stapler a century ago during a particularly savage bout of office politics. In fact, he had been the one who'd rescued Mr. Wells Sr. from the curse, though quite how he'd managed it he wasn't quite sure. He'd seen all manner of disconcerting things lately, and had reached the point where he could think round them or over them, like a knight in chess. But one of the parameters that helped him cling on to the shirt tails of his sanity was that all the weirdness happened inside the office, or else on work-related forays where he could at least prepare himself beforehand. If weirdness was going to jump out at him on all sides like this, he felt that he probably wasn't going to be able to cope for much longer.
I was right,
the girl said, with an expensive-sounding sigh.
Cylinder head gasket's blown.
She took a step back and surveyed the car as though it was something very sad which should have been avoided.
You're looking at a strip-down, cylinder head refacing, new gasket, fan belt, refit, add your recovery cost and VAT on top. It's going to be something around 400 quid, however you look at it. More than this old heap of junk's worth, if you ask me.
The car radio started talking very fast in German. The girl leaned in and switched it off, something that Paul had never been able to do, though he had tried very, very hard. Actually, he said, it's not my car. It belongs to the company.
Oh, right, the girl shrugged. Well, it's up to you. We'll fix it for you if you want us to, but...
Naturally, Paul couldn't explain why the car had to be fixed. That'd be great, he said. Will it, take long? The way she didn't answer suggested that yes, it would.
Hop in the back, the girl said, pointing towards the pickup. We'll give you a lift as far as the garage.
Luckily, it wasn't far, though such things are relative when you're sharing the back of an open truck with chains, coils of rope and a soggy tarpaulin. All the way, Paul tried to assure himself that once they reached the garage, it'd be all right. There'd be grown-ups there who'd do the actual engineering and possibly even offer a rational explanation. He tried not to think about the fact that his car was apparently sentient and that the girl hadn't mentioned anything about using anaesthetics when she was performing surgery. He'd never heard a Volkswagen scream, and he was in no hurry to find out what it sounded like. The garage looked ordinary enough, until the wide galvanised iron doors opened and revealed 3 more under-12s, all dressed in oily overalls. There was a grubby-looking teddy bear on the office desk, and a Barbie calendar on the wall instead of the usual Pirelli. Apart from that, it could have been any small country garage anywhere. A carrot-top 6-year-old with her hair in bunches unhitched Monica from the truck and pushed her into the workshop. Treading warily around the fact that it was way past her bedtime, Paul asked her if there was any chance of doing the repairs tonight, since he had an important meeting first thing in the morning. She looked at him, and Paul noticed with alarm a look in her eyes that reminded him of goblins, or rather of one particular goblin who happened to be the mother of one of the firm's partners, and who also, for reasons best known to herself, fancied him rotten.
Maybe,
the child said, and grinned, making Paul wish he hadn't asked.
I suppose we could do the express service,
she went on, and winked broadly.
But you'll have to promise not to tell.
Fine, Paul heard himself say. I'd really appreciate it, because... The kid leered at him.
Right,
she said.
Push off. You can wait outside. I'll call you when we're done.
Clearly they didn't want him to see, which was fine by him. Ever since he'd had use of the car, who talked back when he spoke to it, he tended to come over faint at the sight of oil. It was cold out in the forecourt, but the rain was only a light drizzle. He found a relatively sheltered spot behind a pile of dead tyres and huddled. In the distance somewhere an owl hooted.
Hey, you!
The door slid back and yellow light engulfed him. He looked up, startled. He didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but he was sure they couldn't have finished already.
Oh, done,
the ginger-haired girl said, grinning at him from around the edge of the door.
You can come in now.
A kid he hadn't seen before, small, fair-haired, glasses, turned the key and started the engine. Monica purred. No rattle, no smoke. That's great, Paul said awkwardly. From the expressions on the children's faces, he had the idea that some kind of miracle had been achieved while he'd been standing outside. He wished he knew enough about cars to appreciate it properly. How much do I owe you? Carrot Top gave him a rather grubby invoice. At least they had handwriting like proper children, and they spelt cylinder with 2 L's. Whatever the express service entailed, it came expensive, and Paul didn't relish the thought of what Mr. Shumway was going to say about it in the morning.
Cash,
Carrot Top added. Oh, Paul looked down at her, worried. I'm very sorry, he said. I haven't got that sort of money on me. He took out his wallet, just in case the folding money fairy had left him a 4-figure surprise. She hadn't. I can do plastic, he said. Or, he remembered, a company cheque. Mr. Shumway had let him loose with the firm's chequebook on the strict understanding that any misuse thereof would be punished by unspeakable atrocities. Otherwise, I don't...
Cash,
the child repeated, and then she caught sight of the J.W.W. chequebook lying inside Paul's open wallet, Bank of the Dead, unmissable on the cover. She looked like she had the knack of reading upside down.
Our cheque will do fine, she said pleasantly.
Paul replied. It just occurred to him that, according to Mr. Shumway, the term misuse specifically included giving J.W.W. cheques to anybody outside the business. Given who J.W.W. banked with, he could see Mr. Shumway's point. Actually, he said, maybe that wouldn't be such a good idea if someone could give me a lift to the nearest cash point.
A cheque, the girl repeated firmly, will do just fine. We've got a stamp, she added, making it sound like a threat.
So Paul wrote her a cheque. The girl waved away the card, and then took the cheque in her left hand, produced a cigarette lighter, and then, Paul said, you'll never guess what she did. Sophie yawned.
Set light to it,
she said, pouring water from the kettle into her hot water bottle. Paul looked at her. Yes, he said. How did you... Sophie had joined J.W.W. on the same day as Paul. They'd found out the great secret together at roughly the same time, that they'd discovered that they were, somewhat improbably, in love. But whereas there were still mornings when Paul woke up and assumed his recent memories were the shrapnel from a particularly bizarre dream, Sophie seemed to have adapted remarkably well to the ambient weirdness. She tightened the hottie bottle stopper and yawned again.
Bank of the Dead, she said. You don't know, right?
Paul nodded.
It's a Chinese thing originally, she said. They believe it's your duty to provide for your ancestors in the next world by sending them money. You buy Bank of the Dead banknotes of real money, and then you burn them, which credits their account.
Paul frowned. Yes, but surely that's just a...
Tax fiddle, yes,
Sophie said, her hand in front of her mouth.
Other companies bank offshore, but J.W.W. has to go one better.
She opened the kitchen door.
You think that's strange. You wait till you see what happens when you use a Bank of the Dead cash point card in an ordinary machine. Well, I'm going to bed. Good night.
Night then, Paul said. He felt faintly disappointed. Not that it was the most grippingly fascinating story ever or anything like that, but... Still, on balance, he approved of the way that Sophie could shrug off the bizarre and disturbing, the way he still couldn't. A sense of perspective, he supposed you'd call it, a vitally important part of being grown up and all that stuff he'd never quite been able to master. But as long as she had one, he didn't have to. That's partnership for you, the Jack Sprat equilibrium. She had her own special strengths, and he... Paul still couldn't see what the hell Sophie saw in him. He caught sight of his reflection in the kitchen window and found no answers there. Tall, thin, unfinished-looking young Englishmen aren't hard to find. The supply tends to exceed demand, whereas beautiful, intelligent, courageous, resourceful, small, thin girls with enormous eyes are a scarce commodity, always highly sought after, even if they do have an unfortunate manner which you can get used to very quickly. Yes, he thought, ordering the kettle to boil, but in the time they'd been together, she'd started to change. It was as though life was an exam the term after next, and she'd already started revising and he hadn't. Where he still drifted from day to day, trying to keep out of the way of the more alarming variants of weirdness and counting himself lucky every time he got home in the same shape he'd left in, she was getting serious about things, in an admirable but not entirely comfortable way. At work she tried hard. At home, she cared about stuff like spin dryers and radiators and putting money aside for the electricity bill. And yes, someone had to do all that kind of thing, and for sure he wasn't capable of it. But even so, it couldn't be too long, could it, before she got sick to the death of the sight of him and... Frowning, Paul ordered the boiling water into his teacup. He then remembered that he'd forgotten the tea bag. He had, of course, assumed that once he'd won the girl of his dreams, that would be that. The story would be over, and somehow complete. Exam thinking again. Once he'd passed, he'd get his little bit of paper with the curly writing and his name and grade, and then he'd have his maths GCSE for ever and ever. Nobody could take it away from him, and he wouldn't ever have to do it again. But there was rather more to being in love. You had to stick at it, or you could lose everything just like that. Not fair, growled Paul's inner child. Not fair at all. Somehow, tea seemed to have lost its relevance. He tipped the hot water down the sink, dried the cup and put it away. He now lived in an environment where cups didn't live on the draining board anymore. When did that happen, and how? The kitchen clock told him it was time to go to bed, since he had to be up bright and early in the morning for the important meeting. Oh well. Perched on the edge of his side of the bed, asleep, Sophie displayed territorial ambitions unparalleled since the collapse of the Mongol Empire. Paul fell into troubled sleep, the sort in which the dreams are all the more alarming because you're pretty sure you're still awake. He dreamed that he was in something like a hospital ward, except there were no nurses or drips or legs in plaster. A dormitory of some kind, except that all the people lying asleep in the beds, hundreds of them, maybe even thousands, were grown-ups. Sophie was there, lying on her side, dead to the world. He knew that something was wrong, but there was nobody to ask. And then Countess Judy de Castelbianco, the entertainment sector partner at J.W.W, was standing next to him, with a clipboard in one hand, smiling. It's all right, she told him kindly. In real life, he hadn't spoken to her since his interview. They can't feel anything. It doesn't hurt, and it's necessary, she added, with possibly a hint of remorse. And be realistic. It wouldn't have lasted anyway. You're far too immature. This way, you're spared the pain. It's for the best. You'll see that in the end. That made sense, apparently. So did the fact that the ward, it was definitely a hospital now, was suddenly full of children, like the ones at the garage. And, wearing white coats, they were walking up and down between the beds. Some of them wheeled trolleys laden with food and drink, cheese omelettes, strong-smelling coffee. Others were inspecting the sleepers, thumbing back eyelids, forcing lips apart with little wooden spatulas, checking pulses and drawing samples of blood. From time to time they found one who wasn't working anymore. They took them away on trolleys and brought replacements. When they came for Sophie... Over there, Judy de Castelbianco called out. Hurry, she's been dead for hours. He woke up. The notice hanging from Ricky Wormtoter's door handle was, as usual, both alarming and profoundly unhelpful. It read, Beware of the Predators. Paul had regarded Ricky Wormtoter, the partner specialising in pest control, with suspicious caution ever since he'd taken Paul out to lunch on the day he joined the firm. Probably Mr. Wormtoter was just being nice. He was the youngest and most affable of the partners, looked and dressed like a movie star trying to be inconspicuous, spoke with a faint German accent and owned, among other things, a flying white horse that could get from London to north of Manchester in the time it took to boil an egg. His work mostly consisted of slaying dragons, who, being attracted to stored accumulations of wealth, tended to be a serious nuisance to museums, art galleries and banks. Vampires, werewolves, manticores and other monstrous creatures that Paul had, until recently, fondly believed didn't exist. Accordingly, he was out of the office a lot of the time, and Paul hadn't had much to do with him since that initial lunch. Paul hadn't been inside Mr. Wormtoter's office before, and he was pleasantly surprised at how normal it was, at least by J.W.W. standards. Apart from a couple of stuffed and mounted heads on the wall that would lead to a mass pulping and rewriting of textbooks if they ever fell into the hands of the scientific community, and a huge walk-in safe in one corner, there were just a plain desk, 3 chairs, and an almost empty bookshelf. Paul, Mr. Wormtoter said, turning round and smiling pleasantly. Thanks for joining us. You know Benny Shumway, I'm sure. Paul knew Benny Shumway, no doubt about it. Instead of snarling at him, however, the cashier raised his left hand and waggled his fingers. Paul sat down next to him and tried to look keen and eager. As I'm sure you know, Mr. Wormtoter said, it's J.W.W. policy for trainees like yourself to spend a month or so in each department, so we can see your strengths lie and you can make up your mind which area you'd like to specialise in. Now, as I understand it, you've done your time with Dennis Tanner scrying for mineral deposits. He's really pleased with your work for him, by the way, though I suspect you're sick to the teeth of staring at photos of bits of desert all day.
And you made a start on sorcery and magic with Huntwells before...
Mr. Wormtoter hesitated. It was Paul and Sophie who'd uncovered Humphrey Wells's treachery towards his uncle, the firm's senior partner. Humphrey Wells now served the firm in the capacity of Xerox machine, on the grounds that the copier is the most hated item of equipment in every office in the world. And since then, he went on, you've been doing odd jobs for all of us while we've been restructuring in the light of, well, you know. He paused, fiddled with the large claw he wore in a chain around his neck, and went on. So really, it's time you both got back on track with your vocational training, and I'd like it if you would consider coming and working in my department for a while. He paused again, clearly waiting for a response. Paul, who had a feeling that he didn't really have a choice in the matter, mumbled, yes, lovely, thanks, or words to that effect. Great, said Mr. Wormtoter. The thing of it is, though, I'm going to be away on a job with Jack, Mr. Wells Senior, and it's likely to take some time. While I'm away, Benny here will be looking after things for me, and so you'll be working with him. Is that going to be okay? Like he could say no, with Mr. Shumway sitting next to him. Sure, he muttered. Mr. Wormtoter smiled. That's fantastic, he said. The fact is, Benny knows the pest business inside out, don't you, Ben? Mr. Shumway nodded. Exceptional economy of movement. Actually, Mr. Wormtoter continued, if there was any justice, he'd be PC partner here instead of me, but... But I retired, Mr. Shumway interrupted, while I still had something to retire with. He shifted slightly in his chair until he was staring into Paul's eyes through his extremely thick lens glasses. What Rick hasn't told you is that pest control is dangerous, as in death or horrible injuries. Also, you've got to kill things. Strikes me you might not want to do that. Well, Paul said, once he'd got his voice back. No, not really. I don't think I've ever killed anything on purpose, he added. Not even spiders or things like that. Usually I try and catch them and... He tailed off. Although obviously he didn't want to be seconded to the dragon-slaying department for 6 months, he didn't want to give the impression that he was totally pathetic and feeble, even if it was true. I don't know, he confessed. What do you think? Mr. Wormtoter was smiling again. Well, he said, here's where Benny and I agree to differ. Benny reckons that pest controllers are born, not trained, and you need to have the old killer instinct if you're going to make the grade. I can see his point, but I've always felt that anyone who wants to do this job is probably too crazy to be allowed to do it, if you see what I mean. After all, it's not like treating woodworm or putting down mousetraps. The sort of pests you'll be up against are highly intelligent sentient life forms. If dragons and harpies and frostines were allowed to go to university, you wouldn't be able to stick your head out of the door in Oxford or Cambridge without getting it bitten off. Which is why, he went on, a gung-ho attitude, no offence, Ben, isn't a survival trait in this area. A healthy instinct for staying alive and an ability to sense and assess danger is what you need, together with the ability to get on and do the job when the claws are out and the flames are licking round your toes. Even though you're so scared you can hardly breathe, because take it from me, doesn't matter how brave you are, when you're on the warm end of 12 tons of an angry dragon, that's how scared you'll be. Better to have someone who knows he'll be scared right from the start, rather than a guy to whom absolute terror comes as a nasty shock. Do you see what I mean? Paul's mouth had suddenly gone dry. He said. And I think, Mr. Wormtoter said, glancing at Mr. Shumway and then looking back, I think that after the way you handled Humph Wells in a really bad situation, I think you've probably got what it takes. Of course, he added casually, if you really feel you aren't cut out for the job, that's perfectly fine. I'll have a word with Judy de Castelbianco, and you can go and do your stint with her, and Sophie can come in with Benny and me. Shit, Paul thought, and it occurred to him at that moment that Ricky Wormtoter probably was very good at his job. At least he had the knack of laying a good trap. No, that's fine, he heard himself croak. When do I start? Benny Shumway walked with Paul back to the office that Paul shared with Sophie. Benny didn't say anything for a while. And then he stopped dead, just outside the closed file store.
"You probably got the impression I don't want you working for me," he said abruptly. "Right?"
"Well,
"Right."
Benny Shumway grinned.
"But no hard feelings," he said. "Ricky was an arsehole, springing that or else bit on you. He knows that you two can't just tell J.W.W. where to stick their rotten jobs, for fear of what Dennis Tanner will do to the both of you for breach of contract. He needs someone to help mind the storeways of gallivanting for 3 months. He doesn't want your girlfriend because he's got a really unreconstructed view of what women should and shouldn't do in the workplace. So you're it, by default. All that I think you got with this take stuff was just flannel," he sighed. "That's Ricky for you, of all the selfish bastards. A selfish bastard who likes to be liked is probably the worst. Never mind, though," he added,
reaching up and slapping Paul in the back with spine-jarring force.
"You'll be all right, I guess. At least," he added with a slight edge to his voice, "you will by the time I'm through with you."
Thanks," Paul said nervously. "How do you mean?"
"You'll see," said Benny Shumway, grinning. "Right. About you. Let's see. Do you work out at all?"
It took Paul a moment to figure out what he was talking about. Well, no."
"I see. Done any martial arts? Judo, karate, taekwondo?"
"No."
"Basic weapons skills? Fencing, genjutsu, marksmanship training? How are you with high explosives?"
Benny's grin was threatening to unzip his face.
"Poisons?" he asked. "Wilderness survival techniques?"
"Not really," Paul said.
"That's all right, then."
Benny Shumway beamed up at him.
"One thing I can't stand is a bloody know-it-all. How about doing exactly what you're told? You any great shakes at that?"
"Oh, yes," Paul said confidently. "I've been doing that all my life."
"Perfect," Benny said. "In that case, there's a fair chance that you might get through this without me having to send you home to your family in a matchbox. Finish up what you're doing. We'll make a start on training you first thing tomorrow."
Suddenly, and without warning, he stuck out his hand for Paul to shake.
"Welcome to heroism."
Paul looked at him. Excuse me?"
"That's the other name for pest control. Fighting monsters. What we do. We're your actual heroes."
Paul studied him for a moment, then thought of the reflection that he'd seen in the window of the previous evening. Are we?" he said. "Oh, jolly good."
"He's a dwarf,"
Sophie explained, as they worked through the last of the Mortensen printouts, apparently meaningless computer spreadsheets that had to be sorted by date order. Well, yes," Paul said. "At least he's a bit on the shorter side, but I wouldn't go so far as—"
"No," she interrupted. "A dwarf. You know, the ones who live in caves under mountains. Fearless warriors, skilled craftspeople, really into gold and wealth and stuff. Don't you ever read books?"
But, Paul started to say, and then he thought, fearless warrior, well, yes, don't know about skilled craftsperson, but he's the cashier, so I guess that figures. "Oh," he said. "Oh, right. How did you—" Sophie scowled impatiently at him.
"Well," she said, "it's obvious, surely. I mean, you have read the Office Procedures Manual, haven't you?"
Oh, Paul thought, that. "Yes," he lied. He'd been meaning to, of course, ever since they'd come to work one morning and found 2 copies of it on their shared desk. 2 enormous, calf-bound, breeze-block-thick volumes, 4,000 pages crammed with tiny, intimidating print. 2 days afterwards, Paul had surreptitiously weighed his copy on the post-room scales. 4.5 kilos, whatever that was in real money. He was planning to get round to reading it any day now.
"Well then," Sophie said. "Anyway," she looked past him, at the far wall. "Is that what you want to do?" she asked. "Hunt monsters, kill dragons, that sort of thing?"
Paul thought for a whole 50,000th of a second before answering. No, of course not. It sounds horrible and dangerous, but I don't think I've got a choice. Sophie nodded.
You could always refuse, she said. I mean, stand up for yourself. Just tell them straight. You won't do it.
You think they'll listen?
No.
Nor me.
But it's so...
She glared at him, as though being the victim was his fault.
I mean, why can't they find someone else to do their silly work for them? Why's it got to be you?
But it doesn't have to be me, Paul didn't say. They could make you do it instead, which is why... Instead he said, it won't be so bad. I got the impression that most of it's just boring and tedious anyhow. Not actually dangerous. I mean, they don't charge around waving swords and dressed in armour anymore.
Don't they? How would you know?
I don't, Paul admitted. But it stands to reason, doesn't it? I mean, technology's moved on, hasn't it? Benny Shumway was talking about explosives and poisons.
And other really safe things to be around, Sophie said. And besides, it's wrong. These are endangered species that you're talking about exterminating. You've just got to look at that Ricky Wormtoter creep to see what sort of man he is. Probably got a dragon's foot umbrella stand in his office. I mean, what harm did a dragon ever do to you?
None, Paul said. Yet, he thought. Look, there's no point giving me a hard time about it. It's the last thing I want to do, or rather, he added, scowling, the last thing but one. The last thing I want to do is give Mr. Tanner an excuse to do horrible things to me for breach of contract. Or had you forgotten?
No, of course not,
Sophie said quickly.
But even if he did, it wouldn't kill you, and you wouldn't be killing harmless dragons either. I really think you've got to be firm this time. Take a stand.
Sophie, there were all sorts of things he could say, all sorts of things just crying out to be said. How it was all very well for her. She wasn't the one who'd been volunteered to fight bloody dragons. She was going to spend the next 3 months learning about the entertainment sector, probably going to film premieres and swanning about at drinks parties, around swimming pools, meeting the stars. Also, what exactly would she do if she'd been the one to draw the short straw? Also, why the hell did she think he was giving in so tamely? If not because he'd refuse, she'd be forced to do it, and then she'd be the one who'd get blown up or eaten by dragons. It showed how much he'd learned in the last 6 months, even without reading the Office Procedures Manual, that he didn't say any of these things or anything at all.
What?
She demanded. Nothing. Sophie gave him a scowl that would have stripped barnacles off the underside of an oil rig and went back to sorting through Mortensen printouts. Paul did the same, vaguely aware that World War III had been postponed at the last moment. Our first fight, he thought, but it didn't make him feel any happier about it. Usually they went out for lunch, to the small Italian sandwich bar round the corner where she'd once bought him an epoch-making ham roll. But today she had a meeting with Judy de Castelbianco to learn more about what she'd be doing. It would probably last all afternoon, and she'd see him back at the flat. Fine, he thought. With Sophie in that kind of mood, he'd probably be just as well. He spent the lunch hour and the rest of the day shuffling spreadsheets and was about to call it a day, 5:25. Everybody was required to be off the premises by 5:30 because of the Goblins, when Ricky Wormtoter came in. He came in without knocking, which was unusual in itself. Also, he looked ruffled, almost worried. He had a suitcase and Paul noticed he wasn't wearing his claw pendant. "Paul," he said, "sorry to bother you, I've got a favour to ask." Sure," Paul answered nervously. "Would it be all right?" Ricky Wormtoter, mumbling. Never in a million years. "Look," he said, and if it had been anybody else, Paul would have thought furtive or even guilty about something. "I don't like to ask, but could I borrow that door thing of yours? You know, that thing you used to get into a place where Humph marooned those 2 clerks?" What surprised Paul most of all was that Ricky Wormtoter was asking. Ever since Paul had chanced upon the Acme portable door, a thin plastic sheet that when pressed against the wall turned into a door that opened onto anywhere or anywhen you wanted it to, he'd been expecting at any moment to be yelled at for misappropriating it and ordered to give it back immediately. He had found it, after all, in a desk drawer. By no stretch of the imagination could be it described as his, and since it was clearly a rare and valuable piece of equipment, he was amazed that nobody noticed it was missing. He finally reached the conclusion that no one, apart from himself, Sophie, Mr. Tanner's mother, and the firm's senior partner, knew that it was him who had got it. But apparently Mr. Wormtoter knew too, and here he was asking nicely. Paul said,
I'll let you have it back as soon as I've finished with it, Mr. Wormtoter went on, totally weird. He was practically pleading. Only, it just might make all the difference for this job I've got to do, and, well, the sooner I get the job done and get back here, the sooner you'll be able to take off pest control duty and put in with Kasosovich or Theo Vansby or somebody. How about it?
Sure, Paul repeated. He reached into his inside pocket and produced the cardboard tube in which the portable door lived. What with one thing and another, he hadn't used it for months. Hadn't even given it a thought. Even so, he felt curiously reluctant to let go of it, and when Ricky Wormtoter practically snatched it from him, he felt a tiny flicker of anger, a minuscule urge to fight. "Thanks," said Ricky Wormtoter, visibly sagging with relief. "That's really kind. You're a pal." While Paul was still speechless, he added, "Well, won't hold you up any longer. You'd better be getting a move on if you don't want to run into any of Dennis's little relatives. Thanks again, Paul. I won't forget this. You're a real lifesaver. And you will get it back, I promise." Mr. Wormtoter grinned awkwardly, sneezed ferociously, and more or less ran out of the room. Oh, Paul thought, a pal, me. Also a lifesaver. A real one, too. Not just some kind of cheap imitation. On the other hand, he reflected, he was now minus one extremely useful enchanted object, which could well have come in handy when, for example, faced with an angry fire-breathing dragon. Presumably, that was why Mr. Wormtoter, his pal, Ricky Wormtoter, wanted it so badly. Oh well. Won't mention this to Sophie, he thought, though he wasn't quite sure why. He put on his coat and headed for the front office. No goblins as such, but Mr. Tanner's mum was on reception. That is, behind the reception desk was a stunningly lovely chestnut-haired beauty he'd never seen before in his life, who winked at him as he went past. Mr. Tanner's mum was a goblin. Like the rest of her kind, she could assume human shape at will, and she made no bones about the fact that she fancied him rotten, something he tried very hard not to think about. Pretending that he hadn't noticed, he hurried past and didn't slow down till he reached the bus stop. It's not true that it's easier to get from Bukhara to Tashkent on a three-legged camel than to travel from the city to Kentish Town by bus. Just seems that way, particularly when you're in a hurry. Paul had found out long before that magic doesn't work on traffic jams, implying, rather disturbingly, that traffic in central London is meant to be permanently gridlocked. So he spent the journey fretting and looking at his watch, which, if anything, appeared to be running backwards. His idea had been to get home before Sophie did, tidy the flat, do the washing up, cook dinner, and generally impress her with his caring, responsible side. After dinner, he'd smear a solemn look onto his face and suggest that it was time they had a serious talk about us, which would please her no end. Us was probably her favourite topic of conversation, and although generally speaking he tended to lose the thread after the first few minutes, it never seemed to matter, so long as he agreed with everything she said and maintained eye contact. That was the plan, a sort of preemptive apology for whatever it was he'd done or was about to do wrong. Unfortunately, infuriatingly, it looked like 60,000 cars had sworn to stop him or die trying. When Paul eventually set toward pavement, it was 35 minutes after his ETA. As he scuttled homewards from the bus stop, he quickly reshuffled his plans. If he still managed to get home first, the main priority was the washing up, followed by a quick skirmish with the dirty laundry on the bedroom floor. Most important of all would be that he suggested the serious talk. Basically, once he'd tabled the motion, that'd be his duty done for the day. He could rely on her to do all the serious talking. When he unlatched the door and flopped through it, his first reaction was relief. She wasn't there, so obviously she hadn't got home yet. And then he saw the envelope. It was on the kitchen table, and it said Paul in her handwriting. And that was very bad, because when she left him little notes to say she just nipped out the shop or the video library, she wrote them on yellow stickies and stuck them on the fridge door. An envelope on the table with Paul on it couldn't possibly be anything good. Feeling as though some malevolent joker had opened him up and stuffed him with newspaper, he sat down and opened it.
Paul, we're finished. When I got home tonight, I realised there's no point going on. I care about you, and I know you care about me, and I also care about us, and I know you don't. It's not your fault, it's just that you're you and I'm me, and I can't see any way around that. And if we tried, we'd end up with neither of us being who we are. I'm sure you can see that, can't you? They want me to go and do 3 months at the Hollywood office. I didn't know they had one, but presumably they do, and when I get back I'll come and get the rest of my things. I've sent the landlord a cheque for my half of the rent, so you needn't worry about that. If you need to get in touch with me, I suppose you can call me at the office out there, but I'd rather you didn't. There isn't anything else left to say, really. I'm sorry, Paul. I didn't mean it to end up like this, but I think we both knew it was coming, sooner or later, and it's best to get it over with and done with rather than dragging on. I think we've both been kidding ourselves all along. It's not because you're a bad person or anything that you've done. I should have been honest with myself earlier, and then it'd never got this far. Don't forget that rubbish has to go out on a Thursday evening. I think the seal's gone on the vacuum cleaner. I hope everything works out for you. Sophie.